Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. It's always nice to come back to Mystic after having been born and lived here for 21 years. And I'm really not that far away, so that I come back quite often, actually. I used to love coming to this library when I was a kid, and I would come on the average of about once a week. And part of the fun of coming here was not just getting a new book to read, but it was on the way home stopping at Bliven's ice cream place and having a sundae. But I couldn't do that every time I came because my allowance was 12 cents a week, and a sundae was something like 35 cents. And so, the reason it was 12 cents a week was my father's salary was probably $15.12 or something like that. And so the change that they would give to me. But I used to love coming here, and the entrance was the old entrance over there, and you'd walk upstairs, and I always just loved looking at the building because it's such a beautiful building. But I always thought the architect made a mistake on the banister because my little hand wouldn't fit around it, because it's in scale with the rest of the building. And I went and looked at that today because I often think about that, and it's in perfect scale, My hand fits all the way around it now. But everything was upstairs at that point, and was only about a third of the upstairs that was used as the library, and the rest of the building was, I guess, just haunted because there weren't any books in it at all. So it's nice to see a thriving building. I hope nobody came because they wanted to hear about clipper ships, because when this was in the paper, it said the talk would be from clipper ships to textiles in the Rossie Velvet Mill Historic District. I know nothing about clipper ships, but I use that in the title because when the clipper ship industry was declining in Mystic, which it was in the early part of the 19th century, there was quite a concern as to what would happen to the economy here in Mystic. And even the Greenmans, who had a shipyard where the seaport is now and had been building clipper ships, were very, very concerned. And they established a textile mill in 1849. And their mill was so successful, I think that they produced woolen products, not velvet products. And their mill was so successful that later on in the century, there was an organization formed called the Mystic Industrial Company, and there were 140 stockholders immediately joining, over a period of a few years, joining this organization, and they raised $22,000 to build a mill and equip it. And that was a lot of money in those days, but I guess, for building a mill, you need quite a bit of cash. And in the meantime, there also evolved the Mystic Board of Trade. And the Mystic Board of Trade somehow, probably through an agent, or maybe the Rossis had an agent who contacted them, but they made contact with the Rossis, who had a mill in Zuchteln, Germany. And I'm probably not pronouncing these things correctly because I don't speak German, but I actually called a friend yesterday that used to teach German, but I still couldn't get it straight. So anyway, somehow the Rossis heard about this situation, and they were concerned about establishing a mill in America because of the McKinley Tariff Act, and the tariff that was charged on imported goods velvet included, especially velvet. It was probably high because it was considered to be a luxury, was very high, and they couldn't afford to ship velvet, or they weren't making much of a profit, let me put it that way, shipping velvet over here. And they wanted to establish a mill here in the United States. And so this is how the Rossie Velvet Mill evolved in a nutshell, because I realized you don't want to stay here all night. I took a speech course one time, and they said, never, 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 if possible, give a lecture at night after everybody has had a heavy supper and probably a glass or two of wine. So I'm keeping things rather brief, and if you have any questions afterwards, we can go into them. And so the Rossis actually came here and took over the mill that was built by this organization, the Mystic Industrial Company. And the company actually owned the mill long after the Rossis came here. And the Rossis just used the mill and became the largest employer in Mystic, Connecticut. They had as many as 500 people working there. And so this was in the 1920s and so forth. And they were very, it was a, I mean, even when I was a child in the 30s, the mill was still functioning, and every morning at 7 o'clock the whistle would blow, and then it would blow again at noon. And I can remember we got out of school for dinner at noon, because we called it dinner then, at 10 minutes of 12, and the whistle blew at 12, and if I wasn't home in that 10 minutes, I lived a mile from the school, my mother would scold me for dawdling along and not tending to business. Then, of course, we'd have to be back at 1 when the whistle would blow again, and then it would blow again at 5 o'clock. And so I mention this whistle because not only could you see the people coming and going from work, but the mill was ever present because of the whistles and the smoke coming out of the big stack, and you know, as I say, the people walking back and forth to the mill. And but why was the mill in that location? I would like to, I don't know if you can all see this, it's rather small, but all you need to see is that this whole area here was one farm. It was all one farm that belonged to Joseph Stanton Williams. And Joseph Stanton Williams owned these 500 acres, and his house was here, and then there was another farmhouse down here, plus a farmer's house in this location. And there was a blacksmith shop at the very corner. That's all there was on the east side of Greenmanville Avenue. Plenty built up along the river, because there was the fishermen and the Greenman shipyard, the remains of it at least, and so on and so forth, where the seaport is. But this was all farmland. And Stanton Williams died in 1889, and he left the top half of the farm, called Elm Tree Farm, to his eldest son, Elias, and he left the southern part of the farm to his other son, named Joseph Stanton Williams, Jr. Elias was 60 years old, probably looking into retirement, probably getting tired of farming. Farming was declining at the rate of 5% a year, and because of technology and trains that had come in, of course, in the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, and refrigerated train cars in 1878, believe it or not. And so that they were shipping, there was the migration towards the west, Of course, everybody that lives in California thinks it's crazy when I say West because I'm talking about Ohio, Illinois, and so forth. And there was this migration from here, and the soil was better out there. They were shipping stuff in, and that's part of the reason why there was this decline, plus other technology and so on and so forth. And so Elias Williams decided that he was going to sell off some of his farm and live on the proceeds from these sales. And he was a stockholder in this Mystic industrial company, and he said, if we raise enough money, I'll give you 2 acres to build the mill. And that's how it all got started, you see. And when the Rossis became established, then there was this massive migration of German immigrants. And they came here, something like 42%, I counted up, of the people, of the Germans who came over here, 42% of the houses that were built in this district around the mill were built by German immigrants. And not all of them, of course, lived within this district, because there were some that lived in Quambog and some that lived on Mistuxet Avenue and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, 28% of the people that built houses in this district were Italians. And that's why I was born in this district, because my parents migrated here and built a house within this district. Neither of my parents ever worked in the Rossie Velvet Company, however, but it was a chain migration, probably the first one that came and settled within the district in 1906. Bonnie, your grandfather, and he did work in the mill. And afterwards, it was a chain migration, and didn't matter whether you worked in the mill or not, but many of them did. And so that's how the area became settled. This is the area, the district that we're talking about, that became the Rossi Historic District and is on the National Register of Historic Places. It begins right here opposite the entrance to the Mystic Seaport. And this is the German club that they built in 1906, right after they came. And it's still functioning all these years later. I don't think there's a high population of Germans particularly that belong to it, but it still exists. And then, of course, you have Bruggeman Place here, which is the street that I was born and lived on, raised on. And this stone wall, which is the division between Elm Tree Farm, where Elias lived, and the lower farm, as it was referred to, where his brother lives. And this house and barn no longer stand. This is where the Rossi Little League field is. But this house still stands, 45 Mistuxet Avenue. And these streets were named, all of the names are associated with Velvet and the Rossi Mill. This one, Bruggeman Place, where I said I grew up, was named after Peter Bruggeman. And when Ernst Rossi came to the United States as the first member of that family to operate the mill, shortly after, a friend of his by the name of Peter Bruggeman came and built the house right here, number 3 Bruggeman Place, which still stands, and Ernst Rossi built his house right here. And I'll talk more about those 2 houses later. But you see, this is Bruggeman Place, this is Rossi Street. Hinckley Hill was named after a non-German. Then you have the Rossi Pentway and the Rossi Mill, and then Velvet Lane up here. And so all of these names are associated with what was going on at the Rossi Mill. This is the area that became the Rossi District. And there are 51 houses in it that were part of this original settlement that took place over several years. I mean, I don't mean to say that all the houses went up immediately after the mill, but there are 51 in the National Register of Historic Places, and the dates given for their having been built is from 1898 to 1950, although the mill didn't function very long after that. And then, of course, there's been just a few infill houses that were built on lots that were vacant since that particular time. It's very interesting too that Stanton Williams, who owned all of this land, plus more over here that I'm not showing, his wife was a Gallup. And the interesting thing about that is that Captain John Gallup is the one who settled where the famous Coogan Farm that's just been acquired by the Pequotspus Nature Center is right up here. There's a little gap in between, but once the two farms were connected, and we presume that Stanton Williams probably acquired some of this land. He inherited a lot of it from his own family, but he probably got some of the Gallup land from that. So that makes a very interesting connection historically. Now, who were the Rossis? As I said, Ernst came first, and his friend Peter Brueggemann followed, and Brueggemann not only became a stockholder of the Mystic Industrial Company, but he also became the superintendent of the Velvet Mill. And he dropped dead on a Sunday in 1910. And it was at that point that John Rossi, Ernst's brother, or Johannes, if you wanted to use the German name, came to America. And he became superintendent of the mill from that point on. And I never knew Ernst because he left this area for New Rochelle, New York. I don't know exactly when, but I presume sometime around World War I. And that's where he lived the remainder of his life. But John Rossi I knew very, very well. And everyone referred to him as Mr. John. And the reason I know him is because over time he bought up most of Elias Williams's farm, but not for the mill. This was for himself. And although he lived on Reynolds Hill, not here, and he owned all of this land up here in this area. Of course, he don't own none of this because this had gone to the other William's son. And so during the Depression, when people were very poor, they'd go and cut cedars that were growing in the overgrown pastures and hay fields, and to use as a Christmas tree. And so we always cut our Christmas tree at your farm in Old Mystic, but at this point, when everybody was going up in our backyard cutting a Christmas tree, I said to my father, why can't we do that, you know? And so my father said, well, we can, but only if we ask Mr. Rossi. And he said, why don't you go ask him? And I was about 7 years old, and I went and I knocked on the door, and Louise Rossi, Mr. Rossi's daughter, who was never married and was his secretary, was very cordial and ushered me in, and she said, "My father's on the telephone right now, but he'll be through in a little while." And so he ushered me into his office finally, and I told him what was I was there for, and he said, "Of course you can have a tree," in this very strong German accent, but he spoke perfect English. He said, "Of course you can have the tree because you're the only one that asked." So that made quite a friendship. And then every morning as I was going to school, Mr. Rossi and Louise in their Packard car would be driving towards the mill, and he would wave at me, which I was really honored because who was I, And here was one of the biggest industrialists in the area. And so, and then, as children often are, I was so intrigued by all of this that I brazenly would call on him at his office for no good reason whatsoever, And he never could be more cordial, He was a wonderful man. Everybody liked him. They called him Mr. John, although he was always very proper and very formal. And of course, he served on most of the important committees in Mystic, like the Mystic Building and Loan Association, and he was on the bank board and so on and so forth. And so he had a long tenure with the mill. And he, when the mill failed in 1937, during the heart of the Depression, he purchased it and all of its machinery, and it no longer was the Rossi Velvet Company. It became the John Rossi Velvet Company, and it functioned until 1955, about 11 years before he passed away. And he sold it at that particular time, and the person who purchased it only operated for 2 more years. And as many of you probably know, afterwards the mill had other uses. At one point, the Temple Radio Company took it over, or at least took part of it over, because it was something like 147 square feet of space. They made cases for radios there, and they were called Templeton cases. And then during the war, the Second World War, there was a unit that made bullets and so on and so forth, and so it had a variety of uses until it stood empty. And as you know, the Seaport finally purchased the building, and it's now used as their, I'm going to call it their curatorial section, because it has a variety of uses, I think. So I think that's pretty much the story of this particular district. Now, it never occurred to me, even though I grew up here, how, I won't say unique, but because there probably are a few other similar districts, but how unusual it is to have the original mill building still standing in good condition, and to have all of the houses still standing, very little altered. And there's nothing unusual about the houses. I mean, there were some late revival styles, and there was colonial revival, and lots of bungalows, because a lot of the houses were built during that era. A few with craftsman styles. There's one built by one of the Italians that is built just like an Italian villa with stone on the first floor and brick on the second floor. and so on. By the way, I didn't point out that this picture is the valley from which these Italians came here to this country. These pictures here are of the development of the Rossie Mill. And this one, which I didn't mention before, the Rossis were so prosperous in their beginning years that they actually developed a mill in Willimantic, Connecticut. And this is a picture of the mill shortly after it was developed. And interestingly enough, it must be a Rossi influence or something, because that mill too has been readapted and it's being used. It probably has 60 businesses in it, but it's still preserved, you know. And I don't know exactly how long, I need to look into that, how long the mill functioned. And then down here is a fuzzy picture of Elm Tree Farm and John Rossi's obituary. And this is the mill in Germany, plus the ones over here. And I should have mentioned, with regard to this bottom picture, I did mention what a kind man that John Rossi was, but I didn't mention that he held an annual picnic every year for his employees. And that picture probably has 100 people in it. And he had this picnic, and on part of this land that he owned, there was what we always called the picnic ground. Anybody could use it. And there was a huge white oak tree right in the center of it, and that was usually the focal point. As a matter of fact, if you look, you can see the tree right in the back of that picture. But, you see, people just didn't gather there. They congregated, all his employees plus his invited guests from all over the state of Connecticut, congregated in downtown Mystic, and they had a parade. And John Rossi marched, you know, he was about this tall, and he marched along at the head of it, you know, very, very Germanic in his style. And this parade paraded all the way through, and then they went up Rossi Street, of course, and ended up at the picnic ground. And part of that deteriorated oak tree still stands. I think it's at 4 Whaler Street, which is in Seaport Heights, which is a development that John Rossi sold off to a developer. And there are tons of houses up here now. And these streets, which only went as far as I show, up to the top of the hill, have been extended, and there's been cross streets put in. But that's not part of the historic district because it has nothing to do with the mill and the immigrants and so forth. Having lived here, you know, I never thought very much about this. I always thought it was very interesting and everything, but I never thought how unusual that it was unusual enough to put it on the National Register. That never occurred to me, even though I sit on the National Register Review Board for Connecticut and have for 25 years. But it took Mary Hendrickson. Are you here, Mary? Yeah. Here you are. It took Mary Hendrickson with the help of some of her friends, and she lives in the district, but she's the one that stayed with the project from beginning to end and got the nomination going. And of course, these nominations I brought one with me if you want to see it. They're about that thick. Her husband took all the pictures for it, or most of them. Some of them are reproduced from collections like yours. Kate Ono, who is a preservation consultant, actually wrote the nitty-gritty of the nomination. It has to have a historical part, it has to have a significance part, and so on and so forth. And when this nomination was being considered, John Hersan, who is the person in the Hartford office that's in charge of all of this, called me up and he said, you know, he said, this nomination is coming in but since you were raised in this district, you're going to have to recuse yourself when it comes up for a vote. And I said, well, naturally, we always encounter this. And, but he said, it occurs to me that there's a lot of research to be done on these houses, and you might be able to help Kate doing this. And so this is how I became involved in the process. And that's probably why I'm giving this talk tonight. But anyway, that's how I became very interested in it. And then about a year ago, Dory Hannah, are you here? No, I guess she isn't here. But anyway, she published in the Mystic Historical Society newsletter a letter that she had received from Stefan Rossi in Germany. Well, when I read this, I actually jumped up out of my chair because in my older years, I keep thinking, I wish I knew more about the Rossis in Germany, see. And so I wrote to her and asked if she'd give me his email address, and she did, and I've had this very active correspondence with Stefan Rossi in Germany, and I'm learning a lot. A lot of what I told you about the Rossis came from him. I'm trying to give credit to everybody that was involved, because very little of this is my actual work. So anyway, I'm glad that this has been done, and it's an ongoing thing. Stefan and I are always corresponding, and in preparing this talk, I came up with a whole list of other questions that I need answers to, that I hope, and he does the same thing with me concerning the American part, and with his cousin over here, have helped him. And I'd just like to conclude by saying that this is really a significant thing to get this on the National Register of Historic Places of the Department of Interior. Because, first of all, it identifies the place as being historically significant. This is not historic districting that governs what color you paint your house or anything like that. It just identifies the significance of this historically. And it's an interesting part of our history because it's industry and immigrants working together as they did in so many instances. And it tells that particular story. And then, of course, the other thing it does, just south of this Rossi Historic District, there's the Mystic Bridge Historic District, but there's a little space in between of about a block. But this sort of ties them together, not physically because of that block, and that could always be changed. Maybe I'll bring that up at the next. But anyway, it ties that together. Then you have this historic seaport as well, and then of course you have just about another block up here when you come to the Coogan Farm. And the Coogan Farm now, with all of its connections, goes all the way over to, if you count the Denison land and what the Pequotchipus Wildlife Center already owned, goes all the way over to the Denison Homestead and beyond. And that's another historic section. And the interesting thing is that the first person that settled on the Coogan Farm way back in the 1640s was Captain John Gallup. And then and he and Captain George Denison fought in the Great Swamp War over in Narragansett in the 1600s. And they were the two founding members, they're considered to be the two founding members of Mystic, Connecticut. And so you have this band history that runs all the way up here on the east side of the river, which includes the Rossi Historic District. Well, that's all I have to say.